A very warm welcome to all of you. In today's lecture, we are going to cover migration systems theory. So, we've done transitional theories, we've done network theories, and systems theory is different from these theories. It's far broader and all-encompassing than the previous theories we've done. And this is seminal work by Nigerian geographer Akin Mabugunje. And so the paper is a seminal paper published in 1970, and I will take you through parts of the paper. I encourage you to read the paper. And so like I said, the systems theory is wide-ranging, as the name suggests, and it also tells us about broader links between migration and development. Right. So like I mentioned, Akin Mabugunje, he's the Nigerian geographer. And so what Mabugunje is saying is that we don't really study rural-urban migration enough. So you see, the paper is written in 1970, and he's arguing that we don't study rural-urban migration enough, and more specifically, we don't study it from the context of developing countries. So he's talking about most of the theoretical foundations so far, and he says that most of the theoretical foundations are in the context of the developed country. And he said that the relevance of developed country migrations, that generally at that time were urban to urban migrations, is something which is not very common for the context of developing countries. And he says that the circumstances of underdeveloped countries have hardly been considered in the theorization of migration. And but empirically at that point in time, it is very much in these areas of the world, the global south, developing countries, where rural-urban migrations were taking place. So he says that therefore this is an opportunity to look at these rural-urban movements, to look at these rural-urban migrations and theorize migration. Now, more in the context of Africa, and what he's saying is that Africa is a unique area, and Africa is a unique area, so one should draw on the empirical evidence to understand rural-urban movements. And so what's very interesting is that he's encouraging us to use a systems approach to theorize migration in the context of the rural-urban movement, in the context of Africa. And in the paper, he talks about how there are cases of seasonal migration, there are cases of non-permanent migration, and he refers to constant circulatory movement between two areas. But this is not how he defines rural-urban migration, and this is not what he sees the essence of rural-urban migration. And this is really very interesting because you know, when we are looking at rural-urban migration, and we know in many empirical contexts, including that of India, we know that this migration is not permanent, right? And Mabugunje's theorization in the 1970s is starting with an acknowledgement that this migration is circular, some of this migration is seasonal, but at the same time, his own definition in the systems approach that he has taken is something which does not fundamentally account for this definition of migration, and we'll see how. So how does Mabugunje define rural-urban migration? So according to Mabugunje, the first component of rural-urban migration is spatial. So he says that what migration does is, migration represents a very basic transformation of what he calls the nodal structure of a society. So you have people moving from smaller, mainly agricultural communities to larger, mainly non-agricultural communities. Apart from this spatial dimension, which he thinks is very, very important, there's also a socio-economic dimension, or what he calls a vertical dimension. And this is largely referring to a permanent transformation of skills, attitudes, motivations, and behavioral patterns that enables migrants to break from his rural background and therefore become entirely committed to an urban existence. So you see, Mabugunje is referring to the permanence of transfer, and for him this permanence of transfer is really the essence of rural-urban migration. He is also arguing that one of the basic goals of economic development is to reverse the situation where 85% of the population is in agriculture and lives in the rural areas. And the situation should actually be the converse, where 85% of the population should live in the cities and work in non-agriculture. And that for him is the basic goal of economic development, right? And then once you have that goal in mind, once you have that framework in mind, then rural-urban migration, according to Mabugunje, represents the spatial flow of a reversal, right? So it's a complex phenomena. There are many institutional agencies involved, and what is really important is that there is this flow then requires adjustments. Not only does it require adjustment, it requires a great deal of adjustment. So therefore, what he's saying is that until so far, you have not really studied rural-urban migration theoretically, and it must be studied theoretically because it is a fundamental component of economic development, and it's a spatial process. So therefore, its spatial impact must be very, very critical in any comprehensive understanding of rural-urban migration. So therefore, what he's arguing is he's actually putting forward a case for studying migration, rural-urban migration, in the framework of general systems theory, right? And so remember, network theory can already explain migration once a system has developed, right? And once a system is developed, network theory can explain migration. It can explain to you why migration operates independent of any government policy. Similarly, so what is systems theory doing? Systems theory is adding to that, and we'll see how it adds to that. And so remember, Everett Lee in his 1966 paper told us that migration is the flow and counterflow of goods, remittances, ideas, and so on. So therefore, even system theory also builds on this. So system theory is using a lot of these concepts, building on all of this, and providing us a far more comprehensive framework to understand migration than what we have. Right. So what is the systems approach? Let's discuss the systems approach in a little more detail. So the systems approach is a broad approach. It's a wide-ranging approach. And Mabugunje argues that this approach demands that a particular complex of variables need to be recognized. A particular complex of variables need to be recognized as a system which has certain properties which are common to many other systems. Now, the systems theory then provides a conceptual framework. It provides a conceptual framework within which a whole range of questions are asked which are relevant to understand the structure and operation, and which are necessary to understand why a particular phenomena is the way it is, right? So the idea is that in this way, through the systems approach, as Mabugunje calls it, or through systems theory, we find new insights into old problems, and new relationships are appreciated which we may not have paid attention to earlier. So what Mabugunje is really clear is that we're not attempting to define anything in a formal or a mathematical manner. And the idea is that he provides an analysis, a verbal analysis of the system and how it is operating. And the idea is that then this kind of, helps us understand how migration fits within systems theory, or through the systems lens, how is it that we can understand migration. Now, coming to the figure, you can see the basic elements in the system in the graph, right? And so it's very clear. You can see how the potential migrant is identified in the graph, and it is the potential migrant who is being encouraged to migrate by stimuli from the environment, right? Now, in this framework, we focus our attention not only to the migrant, but also to various institutions, which Mabugunje calls subsystems. and the social, economic and other relationships which Mabugunje calls adjustment mechanism. And these are an integral part of the migrant's transformation. So now you can see in the graph that there are two important subsystems, and these are the rural and urban control subsystems. Now what does Mabugunje mean by a control subsystem? A control subsystem is one which oversees the operation of general system, and then it determines when and how to increase or decrease the amount of flow in the system. Now, in the rural areas, a control subsystem could of course be the family. It could be the nuclear family or the extended family, and then Mabugunje argues that it is the family that holds back potential migrants until they are old enough to migrate, or even if they are in the age to migrate, a family might not allow them to migrate. There is a difference in the way men and women migrate, and very often men tend to migrate more easily than others. All of these are controlled by the family, right? So then he calls the family a true control subsystem. You can also see how this resonates a little bit with the new economics of labor migration here. The other thing is marriage, right? So when a potential migrant is married, now whether or not he can move alone with his wife and children may actually depend on what the customary role of sex is in a particular society, at what age marriage is encouraged, what is the role of sex specifically in agricultural activities, and also the circumstances in which a young man is supposed to be or is expected to be economically independent from the parents. Now, another control mechanism is the relationship of the family members with the family land, right? And now this kind of can be seen as something which is expressed through the lineage system or which is expressed through inheritance laws. So Mabugunje argues that if you have inheritance laws that encourage most of the land to go to the first child, then that will stimulate migration of other children, more migration of other children. Whereas if you have inheritance laws which, are more equal, then migration may not be affected. Migration of different children may not be affected by inheritance laws. Similarly, you have the size of the farmland, right? What is the size of the farmland? What is the nature of agricultural products? What is the prices of those products? And all of these then will be of significance in someone's migration. The other thing he emphasizes is that other than family, the village community also is a control subsystem. The village community can also act like a control subsystem. Now, how does this happen? Now, it might not be very direct, but it's obvious in a positive or negative way depending upon the activities that a village community sponsors or encourages. So therefore, he gives the example, if you have a village and if the village is attempting to improve its economic conditions through, say, cooperative farming or marketing, then it might then discourage the migration of village members if it is doing activities which are in the village, right? Similarly, on the other hand, you might have a village community which puts a lot of emphasis on social improvement, social betterment through education. Now, in such a context, then the village community inadvertently stimulates migration to the city through training of a younger generation to be more enlightened, to be more motivated, and so on. So, you see how the village community also acts like a control subsystem. So, therefore, a very important aspect of the study of rural-urban migration is to assess how different communities react to migration, right? So, how different communities react to migration, what their perception is of migration makes a lot of difference in the actual act of migration per se. And Mabugunje also argues that such assessments should involve the opinions of not only young people, but also the older generation. And it should include investigating village activities, village administration, what the degree of cohesiveness in the community is, because all of this has a role to play in migration. So, until so far we discussed the rural control subsystem. What about the urban control subsystem? Now, Mabukunje argues that the urban control subsystem operates at the opposite end of the migrant's trajectory, and eventually it encourages or discourages the migrants being absorbed to the urban environment. Now, absorption can be of two kinds: residential and occupational. Basically, the urban control subsystem, it can be identified with the city administration, employment agencies that operate under various laws and statutes. So now, specifically with respect to the city administration, now a city administration can ensure whether you get cheap and adequate housing, which could make the transition from rural to urban difficult or easy. Apart from adequate housing, you also have activities of the city administration. They provide amenities, they provide reception centers, and a lot of services, urban services, factor in on whether a migrant wants to live the urban way of life. If services are good, a migrant might be more inclined to do so. If they don't have good amenities in the urban areas, that might not encourage them to migrate, or that might want them to go back to the rural areas, right? So therefore, amenities play a very, very important role in whether or not migrants want to permanently migrate to the city. But of course, apart from amenities, the major factor is employment, right? The one major factor of urban commitment is employment, and so depending on the kind of job that a migrant has got, whether it's seasonal, whether it's permanent, whether that opportunity offers them to improve their skills or advance their status, whether it provides for social security, whether it helps in upward mobility, whether it provides for retirement, old age, all of these factors are part of the urban control subsystem. The other point about work in the city is the concept of upward mobility, like I mentioned. So within the hierarchy of specializations that the migrant works in, depending upon the job they're doing, the possibility of upward mobility has a huge role to play in how the migrant views the city, and it's also often accompanied by residential changes in the city. So what Mabukunje argues is that, of course, upward mobility depends a lot on rising income, but it's also got to do with your length of stay in the city, right? And the increasing commitment of a migrant part to spend the remaining working life there. So, to sum, I very briefly discuss the rural subcontrol, the urban subcontrol, and I encourage you all to read Mabukunje's seminal paper to look at the various components that he is discussing in the figure in front of you. And broadly, these 5 components are: first is the environment. Now, what is the environment really? The environment is, we're talking about the environment in which the system operates, right? And that's made up of 4 dimensions. And you can see the box. The box is the system through which the migrant moves, right? And navigating economic conditions, social welfare, health, education, technology, government policy. And now the migrant himself or herself is the energy moving through the system. And as we discussed, Mabukunje says that the control subsystems are the ones which determine who departs from the village, and at the urban destination, how migrants are incorporated into the city or the town. What is the adjustment mechanism? Again, both at the rural and at the urban, what is the adjustment mechanism used by migrants to cope with adjustments that needed to be made with the migrant's departure and with the migrant's arrival? And then lastly, the 5th one is, what are the feedback loops, such as returning migrant stories of success or failure, which then in turn act to maintain, increase or depress the flow of migrants through the systems according to which feedback is positive or negative. So coming now again, there's another component that Mabukunje uses, which is the energy concept in system analysis. So what he's really arguing is that a system comprises not only matter, which is the migrant institutions and also various organizations mentioned, but also energy, right? Now, in the physical sense, energy is simply the capacity of a given body to do work. But energy can also be expressed in a number of ways, and he discusses two forms of energy. So, the first is potential energy. Now, potential energy is the body's power of doing work by virtue of stresses resulting from its relation with its environment or other bodies. So, that's largely how he defines potential energy. The second form of energy is kinetic energy, and this is the capacity of a body to do work by virtue of its own motion or activity. So, now in the theory of rural-urban migration, potential energy can be likened to the stimuli of acting on the rural individual to move. And then once an individual has been successfully dislodged, he calls it dislodged. So, once an individual has successfully moved or he has been successfully dislodged from the rural area, we can assume that he is translating his potential energy into its kinetic form. Now, within the systems framework, then the explanation of why people are migrating must be in terms of differential individual responses to the stimuli, both from the environment and from within the system. So, therefore, you can see how it differs from the push-pull hypothesis in putting emphasis at the individual level, not on why people migrate from particular areas, but why any person from any village would want to migrate to the city. And what's also really interesting is that he's built in expectations and aspirations, and he's arguing that the notions of expectation and aspiration is central to an understanding of the ways in which stimulus from the environment is transmitted to individuals, and for that reason it's a crucial variable in the theory of rural-urban migration. And what I find really fascinating is that in 1970, the aspiration turn in migration studies took much later, literally at the turn of the century. So that in the 1970s that he's talking about aspiration and he's built it into the model of, to the systems approach is really quite seminal. So now let us look at, we'll discuss what DeHaas has to say on the systems theory. And as you know, this DeHaas's working paper is a very useful working paper that we are anchoring much of our theoretical discussion. So, DeHaas, sort of reiterates what the migration system is as per Mabuganje. DeHaas is saying that the migration system is a set of places linked by the flow and counterflow of people, goods and services, exchange, which tend to facilitate further exchange, including migration between places, right? And so what DeHaas is also doing is that he's extending this to international migration, and he discusses how the migration systems theory has been extended to international migration by several scholars such as Alejandro Portes. And so what do we mean when we say the systems theory is extended to international migration? So the first thing is that so now the unit of analysis therefore becomes the nation state, right? So just the way Mabuganje talks about rural-urban migration and uses that as a framework to theorize internal migration, what DeHaas is expanding upon is that countries, cities within countries, feedback mechanisms that connect people, goods, services, ideas, information, all of this can be expanded to the all of this can be extended to international migration. So then he's going on to argue that formal and informal subsystems operate to perpetuate and to reinforce the systemic nature of international flows by encouraging migration along certain pathways and discouraging it along others. So therefore, the end result that you have is that you have a relatively stable set of exchanges that yield an identifiable geographical structure that persists across space and time. And the other point which is really important is that you have initial circumstances at both receiving end and serving end that are modified by the migration process, right? So therefore, the fundamental point then also of the systems theory, the systems approach is that we need to study the causes and consequences of migration together. We should not be studying them separately as many theories do, because both the causes and the consequences are part of the same systems and processes, right? So what migration really does is it simultaneously reshapes socioeconomic development at both origin and destination, and then these in turn are likely to influence subsequent migration patterns. The other point that Dehaas makes on systems theory is that you have the influx of international remittances. So you see, now he's extended it to the international migration stream, and you have influx of remittances, and this can also then increase intra-community inequality. It can increase feelings of relative deprivation, and then this can contribute to a culture of migration. So remember neoclassical theories that sort of spoke about this equilibrium, and they argue that the main reason of migration is this equilibrium. And then we went on ahead and we saw that, well, okay, in other theories, relative deprivation matters, right? So at a particular source, in a particular source region, if you have a migrant family and you have a non-migrant family, and the inequality is increasing as migration is increasing in the village, as households are migrating or individuals are migrating, they're becoming richer, they're becoming more prosperous. So even for households that may not be poor, but the relative deprivation increases, right? And then that creates aspirations and desires to migrate, and then that can contribute to a culture of migration, right? So therefore, migration induces changes in social and economic structures that in turn make additional migration more likely. And then the other point, which is a very important point that Dehaas makes, is that, so what system theory also does is that you have to include non-migrants to study the reciprocal effects of migration in the entire development context, right? So now this inclusion of non-migrants is also a methodological point. Now the weakness of many studies is that they include only migrants when they study migration. So for instance, transnationalism, right? Now transnationalism conceptually largely focuses only on case study, right? So but if we really want to understand migration through the lens of system theory, which kind of is all encompassing, we have to study non-migrants as well. And then of course, you know, we need to look at the factors that cause, shape, perpetuate migration. And now within this, we can also look at spatial. So you see, the systems theory largely, as Mabukunje says, it is spatial. And so, you know, we're also then looking at spatial geographical structuring of migration patterns. We're looking at models across space and time, and all of these can be integrated with the transitional model that we studied earlier. Remember Zelinsky's transitional model, where he links vital development with mobility transition, where he links patterns of development with how mobility moves. So this can very well be done with systems theory. So we can have transitional theories as part of system theories, right? The other thing system theory does is it helps us understand how migration evolves over time, and how it is reciprocally linked with broader processes of development. And so therefore, in that sense, this the theoretical structure of systems theory, it is definitely superior to static theories such as push-pull, neoclassical, structuralist approaches that we've looked at, and it's also in conflict with these, right? And then all of these theories that we saw, whether it's push-pull, whether it's neoclassical, whether it's structuralist, all of these draw on a sedentary notion that migration and development are substitutes, whereas system theory looks at them as complements, right? That migration and development complement each other. And this is something that, as we go on, we will discuss further. So now, very broadly, you have a sense of systems theory. We've discussed Mabgonje's paper, and we've also looked at Dehaas's take on systems theory. Now, I want to share with you, why is it that the systems theory has not been so popular? It is all-encompassing. It is quite comprehensive. It draws on a lot of other previous theories and builds on these theories. So why is it that it is not so widely used? And so geographer Russell King tells us that on the one hand, system theory is appealing because it emphasizes on the dynamics of flows, interlinkages, adjustment, and feedback. It progresses beyond the linear push-pull models of migration between A and B. It is multiscalar. It links macro with micro, and it also allows us to sort of, look at how various subsystems nest within larger systems. It has the potential to integrate with international migration, like we saw earlier. But why is it then it's not been widely applied? So the first reason is because of its wide scope, right? Because of the multiple kinds of data it demands, it's very difficult to operationalize it in an empirical study. It's also very difficult to operationalize it in research projects and so on. So then, while the breadth and the flexibility of the migration system theory is appealing, it's also overstretched, and its integration, synthesis with multiscalar components becomes very difficult. So with that, we come to the end of this lecture on migration system theory. Like I said, the main reading for this lecture is Akin Mabgonje's seminal paper, Systems Approach to a Theory of Rural-Urban Migration. I encourage everyone to read this paper, and we've also drawn on Russell King and Hein Dehaas's work on this paper. And with that, we come to the end of this lecture. Thank you very much. I hope you found it useful.